Welcome to DECODE. Let me start by wishing you a happy 2026. Yes, I know, another year, more chaos. And here's another smart YouTuber telling you what's gonna happen, right? Well, no, this is not that video and I'm not that YouTuber because I'm not pretending to be so smart. Today, what I want to do is something different. I want to zoom out with you. Let's imagine we're both on a spaceship, but this spaceship does not fly through space. It actually allows us to fly through time. And so from up here, we can examine the last 7 decades of human history all at once. And when you look at them together, it's interesting because patterns begins to appear. Chaos stops looking like chaos and it actually turns into trends. And suddenly, everything we see going on the world today, from Taiwan to Greenland, from Africa to Venezuela, it actually starts making sense. So I'm not here to tell you exactly what's going to happen in 2026. No way. I'm here to decode 2026, to tell you the trends, the hotspots, the actors shaping what comes next. So, do you want to tag along? Come on, the ship is leaving. Okay, let's begin our journey, and to understand 2026, of course, we need to begin rewinding a little bit. Because for roughly the last 50 years or so, the world has run on a very simple but powerful idea. This idea was not written anywhere, but all of us, we believed in it. And this idea was that after World War II, which was huge destruction, if we traded with each other, we could stop the fighting. If our economies depending on one another, things would stay stable because we would need each other. In a way, I've always been talking in previous videos about game theory. The whole idea was that cooperation in the long run would beat competition. And basically, the Americans and the Europeans and the Chinese and the Russians and all of that, we could all get along if we traded together instead of waging war. And so, as a consequence of that, what happened is that, of course, international trade emerged after World War II. And because of international trade, countries stopped trying to manufacture everything themselves. What happened is that we actually optimized. For example, you take care of making chips, and I will buy chips from you, and I will make cars, and you buy cars from me, and that is bilateral trade, and we've seen this across the world, from, Asia to Europe to the Americas. And then at that point, basically, somebody takes care of most of the things that we do, and we buy and sell from one another. So, of course, because trade actually did work, security began taking a back seat. Sure, we had the Cold War, but basically after World War II, there was no major military conflict that affected the whole world. Economics took the leading space, and war came kind of like second. And so we spent a little bit less on military, and we spent a little bit more on, let's say, welfare. And to be fair, this system worked. Basically, it fueled in the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s massive growth, goods became cheaper, inflation stayed relatively controlled for decades. And for example, there's some huge success cases like China. For example, China, because of international trade, was able to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But it's not only about China. Here in the West, for example, consumption exploded in a way that was unthinkable before. Just try to imagine a shopping mall or a supermarket 40 years ago, when I was a kid. Of course, the amount of goods and services that we enjoy today is much larger than what we had when we were kids. That's all the result of this process of international trade, which is what we would call, in general, globalization. But of course, with globalization, there's a part that's actually very easy to miss, which is, sure, we see the benefits, but we don't see so much the downsides. Globalization had some inner fragilities. The first one was that some industries disappeared in some countries. For example, in my country, Spain, before we entered the European Union, sure, we manufactured everything here, but then we discovered that, for example, Swiss chocolate was better than ours, and then we began buying chocolates from Switzerland. And for example, we discovered that manufacturing actually electronics was actually better done in East Asia, and so we stopped doing that. So what happened with this disappearance of certain key industries in different territories is that we built the idea of supply chains, right? And these supply chains, of course, they benefited some very few places. For example, there's a supply chain from Taiwan, and we'll be talking about Taiwan later, with regards to electronics. And then there's a supply chain, for example, in Venezuela, with regards to oil, and that's why all of these places have become hotspots, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So again, the first fragility of globalization was supply chain dependency. The second weak spot of globalization was the immigration. Immigration basically moved faster than societies could absorb it. Let's face it, 50 years ago, a guy from Ecuador or a guy from Pakistan was not so aware of Spain as a country, but now because of social media, because of cheaper airplane travel, because of all those reasons, immigration exploded in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and of course up to now. And basically it moved faster that societies could absorb it. Basically, we got too many immigrants too quickly, so that we could actually have some sort of contingency plan to deal with them. So again, first, dependency on supply chains. Second, the boom of immigration, and third, inequality. Basically, sure, we all had access to cheap stuff, and we were happy with cheap stuff, but quietly there was a gap opening between the elites and the average Joe on the street. If you look at the gap between the salary of the top paying executive and the basic employee of a certain company, that gap has multiplied by a factor of 10 from the 70s to today. So again, what I'm trying to say is the boss of a large company compared to the lowest paying wage of that same company, that gap, which is a natural gap, of course, there's a higher responsibility and skill, but that gap has multiplied by a factor of 10 since the 70s. So again, with all those things, what happened is that there was a certain sense that globalization, sure, it was working on some areas, but it was failing on some others. And then slowly, this globalization, which was seen as a good thing in the beginning, began eroding. And it was eroding slowly, not because it was a bad idea, but because this globalization, it needed something invisible, something extremely powerful, yet something we had never thought about. And that something that I'm going to talk about is something that has vanished in the last 5 years. And that thing that globalization needed and we have lost, and it's the basis of the modern world, is that globalization needed trust. Let's talk about trust for a moment. Basically, if you think about it, any sort of global trade system like globalization, for example, if you boil it down to its core, is basically a trust deal. It's a trust deal because I'm telling you, for example, China, hey, I trust you to manufacture certain things and I will stop manufacturing them because I trust that you will not use that against me because you need me for some other things, for example. And so again, for a long time, that trust that was a requirement of international trade, it felt obvious and, almost boring, a little bit like a marriage. Imagine a marriage that works. There's lots of hidden rules and nobody talks about those rules. They're just there and basically they make the marriage work. So international trade, it was actually based on trust. And then what has happened, as I will prove in this first section of the video, is that one day that trust, like Kaiser Soze in the famous movie, was gone. It happened along a period of time of about 15 years. It was not a big explosion that destroyed trust. It was just more like a series of cracks that slowly eroded these cracks, destroyed globalization, and now we are in a post-globalization kind of world. So let's see how we destroyed trust. The first break in the trust system, in my opinion, comes to 2008 with the global finance system collapse. Lehman Brothers and, the crisis in Iceland with the banking and subprime mortgages, all that kind of stuff. If you remember, before that time, we trusted our politicians and we trusted our bankers. I mean, not 100%, but, we had a certain level of trust in them. And then what happens is that we find out that our bankers have been playing monopoly with our money, and then lots of financial institutions go down, and with them, many countries, such as Iceland, for example, and of course there was huge problems in the US with people who lost their homes, and the same thing here in Spain. And so at that time, when the financial system almost collapsed in 2007, 2008, what happened is that people realized how fragile our system was. We thought everything was fine and everything was stable, and then we realized maybe this is not so stable. Then the second big crack on the building of trust was actually coronavirus, COVID, right? Sure, we were all trading with each other and, treaties and all that kind of stuff and the World Trade Organization. But then when the debt began piling, what happened is that it was very much each one to its own. And so each country actually dealt with COVID in an isolated manner without actually trusting this supply network. Borders were slammed shut. Countries were hoarding masks and not sharing masks with other countries which were supposed to be their allies. Supply chains snapped, and there was a lot of disasters with regards to acquisition of vaccines and medicines and all that kind of dynamic that we're all aware that came with COVID. Even basic medicine became hard to get. Here in Spain, people were paying like 10 times more for a mask than what they were paying before coronavirus. And of course, in that moment, again, the trust building that I was telling about began shaking a little bit more. We already had, limited trust in banks and politicians. Then we had less trust in other countries because of everything that happened with coronavirus. And then we had like the final nail on the coffin. And that final nail is, in my opinion, Ukraine. Basically, what happened is that, of course, there was an unwritten, it actually was written, there was a non-aggression pact between, the East and the West, between Russia and, the European Union and the US. And basically, the borders had been kind of like more or less stable for decades, since World War II, basically. And then what happens is that Putin one day says, oh, yeah, I will not invade Ukraine. Don't worry. And then 1 week later, he puts tanks across the border. And that trust that we were supposed to be having between East and West actually goes absolutely down the sink. Putin broke the status quo. But the interesting part here is that once trust is broken, it really doesn't matter who broke it, because basically both are going to blame each other. For example, I'm Spanish, so I'm in the West side of things, So to me, of course, Putin broke his word of not invading Ukraine, so that's him breaking the trust system. But then if you look at Putin, he's going to say, no, that's not true. Who broke the trust system was actually NATO expanding towards the East in the last years and decades, and that's what forced me to come into Ukraine. And honestly, it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, what we have is hundreds of thousands of dead, and we have a trust system that's absolutely destroyed. And so once we lose trust, what happens is that we begin weaponizing everything, because everything can be used as a threat or as a deterrent towards enemies. Your sources of energy can be weaponized. Or isn't it true that Venezuela matters because of oil, which is basically energy? Food gets weaponized. For example, Ukraine was a huge supplier of food, and now, with Ukraine in the middle of a war, that generates a big crisis in regards to food. Same thing with finance. With finance, we've seen all over the world, different countries fighting financially one another, be it with stocks or with crypto or with bonds, etc. Again, when we stop trusting each other, basically, there's something that really clicks inside the minds of the governments. They learn a lesson that it's very hard to unlearn, which is, if I don't trust you and I depend on you, you can hurt me. And that's the big change. Before, in the era of globalization, we basically trusted each other and we didn't see each other as a threat. But the moment that basically interdependence stopped feeling like cooperation and starts feeling like exposure, it's very hard to go to the old mindset of cooperation and globalization. Trust did not collapse overnight. It eroded slowly and quietly, but basically one day we woke up and we realized it was not there anymore. Countries were not trusting each other. And once trust was gone, the whole world order as we knew it began to crumble. So we have understood how we have been losing trust with each other for the last, let's say, 15 years. But then the question you may ask is, but why specifically now? Why are we talking about this in 2025 and 2026? How is it that everything seems to break specifically in this particular moment in history? Well, I'm going to tell you that, and it has a lot to do with, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. But to explain this better, I'm going to do it with a metaphor, with a story. Not long ago, I went to a funeral, like, many of us have to do every now and then, for a woman in her 90s, and at some point, of course, I heard a conversation and someone asked the obvious question, which was, oh, what did she die of? And somebody said, oh, the flu took her. And of course, I remember thinking to myself, from a distance, that's not true. That's not what happens when you're 90 years old. Sure, she did die of the flu if you do a very shallow analysis, but that's not really what happened. What killed her most likely was age and the deterioration of the human body, years of slow weakening. And then flu was kind of like the nail on the coffin, as the expression says. But really, it's not really the deep cause, it's more like the shallow cause. Okay, so this story of the funeral is a very good metaphor of how historical shifts actually work. Trust had been eroding for years, and if you ask me, about 15 years, quietly, invisibly. And then what happened is that in this context of loss of trust, two key figures appear: Trump and Putin. And they are not the cause, just to be very clear, of the collapse of trust. No, they are the trigger. If age, in my example before, was the loss of trust for this lady and flu is what killed her, you need to understand that Trump and Putin, they are the flu. For example, let's talk about Putin first. Putin broke the status quo and invaded Ukraine. By doing that, he was saying loud and clear, I don't trust you anymore. Trust is already on the downhill, but he is the trigger that says it's over. Same thing on the second mandate of Donald Trump. By the way, this is not a video pro-Trump or against Trump. That's not my role. I'm not even from the US. I'm just trying to describe things. Okay. So on the second mandate of Donald Trump, he came back louder, screaming, make America great again, America first, and openly rejected cooperation. Right? So again, it was already losing trust. Trump is the nail on the coffin. And then what I wanted to see is that Putin and Trump, they have very different personalities, very different countries, very different backgrounds and life stories, as you can imagine, but they have the same instinct, which is both of them are old. And I'm not saying old in the sense of age. No, their thinking is old. Trump and Putin both think in terms of territory, in terms of dominance, in terms of chest thumping, and they believe that a short-term win for them, it's better than long-term stability. So they are not going to engage in complex structures that have an impact in the next 10, 20, 30 years, like, NATO or the European Union or that kind of stuff. No, they're going to seek things that work in the short term and paint them as the savior of their country. They both make the same kind of like calculation, which is, if I can win in the short term, I don't really care what are the downside effects of that 10, 20, 30 years in the future. So what I want you to think about is, imagine the world is one of those big tabletop board games, like Risk, Risk or Monopoly. And in that board game, everybody is at the table, Spain and the European Union and the US and Russia and Japan and China and yada, yada, yada. And we were all playing in that board, which is the board of globalization, by the same set of rules, which we set kind of like after World War II, so to say, And as long as everybody played by the rules, the game kept going. Sure, the players, through time, they began looking like sideways, like, I don't know if I trust this guy, if I trust that guy. That is the erosion I was talking about. But the game was still going, and as long as the game was going, everybody was sitting at the table. And then what happens is that we get people on the table, which is Putin and Trump. And you know what? They don't like this game. They don't like it at all. I mean, they've said this open and wide. Trump has said he does not like globalization and a multipolar world. And the same thing can be applied to Putin. And so what happens is that they begin thinking, they, meaning Trump and Putin, there's a different set of rules that would work better for me. Me is the key word here, for the US or for Russia. Sure, trust was eroding already, as I've said before, but basically there's a moment in which Russia says, borders? Nah, they don't matter anymore. Since World War II, we said borders are relevant and, the borders of countries need to be respected. Russia said, no way. I can live without those borders, and then the US in turn, sitting on the other side of the table, said, all my international commitments, they're worth nothing. Sure, I'm a member of the World Trade Organization and, the World Health Organization and all these kind of institutions. You know what? I don't care. I'm going to do my own thing, even if it means breaking with these organizations. For example, all the climate change treaties that Trump has rejected, just to name a few, right? And so when the two biggest players stop respecting the rules, it's not that the trust actually weakens, is that the whole game collapses. I mean, Trump and Putin, they have taken the board and they have done like this. And so the game is not playable anymore. We have broken the game of international relationships. And so, of course, once that happens, what you need to understand is that trust collapses at the top, at the government level, but basically it doesn't stay there, the conflict. It generates a huge shockwave through society, and it affects you and me, and it affects everyone, and it affects villages, and it affects countries, and it affects, trade unions, etc., etc., etc. It's a shockwave that eventually hits everyone, and it hits everyday life. And so I want now to connect this to what I was saying before. Remember, I said globalization had a defect, which was the defect of, immigration and supply chains and all that kind of stuff. Okay, let's see how that shockwave around the loss of trust and globalization expanded here. First, immigration. Again, if you think about it, globalization requires trust between countries. Like, for example, Europe trusts the US. Not now anymore. With Trump saying he wants to conquer Greenland, what trust? There's no trust anymore. But now I want you to think about immigration. Immigration requires trust within the country. Right? For example, people in the US, they need to think, oh, you know what? These immigrants from Latin America, they come here to work and to make our country better. That was the thinking in the 90s, or from Pakistan, or from Somalia, or from any of these countries. Here in Spain, we get lots of immigration from Pakistan, from Morocco, from Romania, from Latin America. Back in the day, we trusted these people. You see the trust that I was talking about? Okay, then when we erode trust and we take it away from the equation, what happens? Well, what happens is that suddenly that same neighbor that we thought was a good guy, now he becomes suspicious. Now he's scary. Now there's somebody, an opportunist, in this case Trump, telling us that immigrants are evil. See the change? You see what I said? Globalization had a weak spot with immigration because too many came too quickly. Then once trust is destroyed, we go for immigration. And again, let me prove this. Let me say this loud and clear. This is wrong. All data proves that immigration is overwhelmingly positive for countries. Let me tell you why in a nutshell. I don't want to take too much time. Most countries in the developed world, since the woman actually entered the labor market, the birth rate actually went down, and some of them are actually below the replacement rate, such as Japan, such as Spain, most of the EU, many states in the US, they have actually negative birth rate when it's compared to the death rate. So basically, unless we get immigration, our population actually shrinks and it goes to collapse. For example, the population of my country, of Spain, would divide by a factor of 2 in 50 years unless we have immigration. So of course, immigration is positive. It's positive demographically, as I have explained, and because of demographics, it's actually positive economically because these people, sure, maybe they're humble today, but you know what? Their sons will go to university. Their sons will actually have high quality paying jobs. And so because of that, they will balance the financial system. And of course, immigration is also positive culturally because we're living in an interconnected world. And sure, there's a tiny fraction of criminals. Of course, and it's proven that actually immigrants have a higher rate of criminals than native population. And that makes perfect sense for a very simple reason. Immigrants typically come from humble backgrounds, so it's easier to have a little bit of, like spoiled apples among that group compared to the people who live here who have a higher standard of living. That makes sense. For example, in my country, Spain, the percentage of immigrants who actually commit crimes is around 2%. So again, let me repeat that number. 98% of immigrants are perfectly fine, like you and me. 2% are criminals. Yeah, do you stop eating apples because there's one spoiled apple? No, you don't, right? So the problem with immigration was actually speed without capacity. The government said everything was under control and people could see that it wasn't really, So citizens did not lose trust in migrants only. No, they lost trust in state competence. Immigration became the scapegoat to say, oh, globalization doesn't work. Remember, they're Haitian, they're eating the dog, they're eating the cats. Remember that sentence? And that's when the old world order, the order of globalization, of multilateralism, of cooperation, collapsed, reacting through power projection. Of course, the US is the most powerful country on earth, and so their foreign policy now is going to become way more aggressive, way more dominant, because they want to, again, secure their zone of influence and expand their zone of influence. The strength of the US and the might of its military, they need to become visible. And we're going to see more of that in this year. And we're seeing it already under the leadership of Donald Trump. Remember, Trump is actually betting his future on the midterm elections that happened this November. So from now to November, I'm forecasting the US to be in a very aggressive international posture, which is part to secure the zone of influence, and second, to basically secure the election for Donald Trump. You know, and anyone who says that the US shouldn't be doing this, I can forecast this, they're going to be called enemies of the state. So I'm sure anyone who's not MAGA at all is going to be labeled enemy of the state for the next 10 months or so. And again, remember this, I'm Spanish. I don't care about Trump one way or another because it's not my president, it's not my country. I'm just trying to describe behavior. Russia, being very different, is going to be basically the same. You know, they react through force, you know, territory buffers, coercion, and military power compensating for economic weaknesses. I don't foresee Russia changing too much their strategy this year. Honestly, they're stuck in this war in Ukraine that they would never had. It was a really terrible idea. And I'm sure if Putin could turn back time, he would never invade Ukraine again. But again, he cannot admit that, because in Russia, if you admit that you made a mistake, your career as a politician is over, and most likely your life is over as well. The third player here is China. And I'm not going to talk about China now, because I'm going to talk about China later in the video, and you'll see why. And we'll talk about them later, as I said. But again, all these players, there's different stories, but they're all responding to the same reflex, which is that once this spiral of fear begins, every island, every strait, every mineral deposit suddenly matters more. And now we worry about the Canal of Panama, now we worry about Greenland, now we worry about Taiwan, etc. And so that's why now on this video, I'm not going to be abstract anymore. I'm going to be purely geographic. I'm going to go hotspot by hotspot, explaining what's going on and what I think is going to happen this next year. Okay, so let's start with Europe. That's my homeland. I know it really well. And you may think Europe is old, because it is old. You know, we have old cities, old institutions, old politicians. But ironically, in this game of, multiplayer risk that we're playing, in this game, Europe is actually the modern player, as you'll see. As I said, Russia and the US are moving with a mindset which is rooted in the 1910s, you know, before World War I, the age of empires. You know, spheres of influence, power through force. But here's the reality. Europe lost millions of young men and women due to that stupidity. And I want to use this word on purpose. That stupidity is what provoked World War I and then World War II. You know, and we lost, tens of millions of citizens, almost 100 million citizens during those two wars, which actually began in Europe. You know, so if there's one thing that Europe has learned the hard way, is that empires don't work. Empires are confrontational. In the long term, they take us straight into a war. Europe, for that reason, after World War II, it built something else. It built a model based on cooperation instead of domination, rules instead of brute force. And you know what? For 50 years, that model, the model of the European Union, worked, until Ukraine actually exposed the blind spot, the blind angle of the whole model of the European Union, which is because Europe was an economic alliance, basically, it had outsourced its defense to the US. I mean, let's face it, let's all be honest, we didn't care so much about defending ourselves because we knew we were under the umbrella of NATO, and there was this kind of like unwritten pact of, we will open our doors to all the American companies and the American trade in very convenient conditions, and we'll give you a market of 400 million highly with high wealth individuals, which is Europe, to the American companies. But basically that comes with a price, which is, when the time comes, the US will defend Europe through NATO. But now, again, as I've said before, loss of trust. What happens? Mr. Trump says, we'll see if I defend Europe in the case of war. We'll see if I care about NATO anymore. And so when the USA only cares about itself from a military standpoint, Europe feels that it's in danger. So what is going to happen? What's the play of Europe in 2026? First, Europe is going to try to stop Trump without escalating the conflict. We all know that Trump loves to escalate and loud words, as we saw with Zelensky on the White House in that meeting that went off rails. So Europe does not want to play that game of confrontation and escalation. But Europe knows really well that Trump is transactional. He's a businessman. He's a negotiator. It remains to be seen if he's a good or a bad negotiator. But he is a negotiator at the core. And Europe holds a card that even Trump cannot ignore, which is access to one of the largest integrated high wealth markets on earth. Sure, Trump, whenever he can, he tries to pressure individual countries of the EU. For example, he complained about Spain, saying, Spain doesn't spend enough on NATO. And now he's complaining to Denmark because he says, I want Greenland. In case you didn't know that, Greenland is actually part of Denmark, actually. And those are small countries, extremely small compared to the power and the might of the US. But the problem is, whenever you attack Spain, what happens is that the next phone call is not from Spain, it's actually from Brussels, and it's actually the lead of the European Union saying, hey, don't mess with one of our members. And the same thing happens with Denmark. If you attack Denmark, basically what's going to happen is that Ms. von der Leyen, which is one of the chiefs of the EU, is going to call Mr. Trump and say, hey, are you sure you want to go that route? Because again, the market that we all share is actually very convenient for everyone. And so if you begin saber-rattling against Europe or one of its members, that could not be beneficial for the US. So again, first of all, I think Europe is going to show its teeth more to Trump, but in a non-confrontational way, as we typically do, just to make sure Trump does not do anything silly. Second thing that Europe is going to do is to rearm rapidly and heavily. Think about this. Again, we outsourced our security to the US, and that was a big mistake. Of course, due to that, we didn't have to spend that much money on weapons, and we could spend it on welfare states and all that kind of stuff. But basically, now it's obvious that we need to be able to defend ourselves. Not only because the US could be fading away, but more because we have a threat that we didn't have before, which is Mr. Putin. If Mr. Putin is actually, sending drones across the border through the east side, we need a drone defense system, and we need it like tomorrow, literally. And so we need a serious military policy in the EU. That's not an imperial fantasy. It's actually a serious industrial policy to build European weapons on European soil with European supply chains. And you know what? Guess what? European jobs. And this is something that Trump actually provoked, but he didn't see coming. Trump, of course, wants to increase the GDP of the US. And so when he said, oh, Europe, you need to basically invest more in defense, he was daydreaming that this would benefit Boeing and, McDonnell Douglas and Lockheed Martin and these kind of companies. But the reality is that money that was actually flowing towards Washington to buy American-made weapons, because of this loss of trust, is going to stop flowing so much in the Washington direction. And it's actually going to flow into Germany, into Spain. I mean, just look at the stock value of the company Rheinmetall. Rheinmetall is a German company that builds basically tanks and, weaponry and, munitions, all that kind of stuff. Their stock value is actually, off the charts. Why? Because again, we are going to invest in defense, and we're going to invest in defense locally because we have lost trust in the US, as I was saying before, about this process of loss of trust. And you know what? That could have it's a bitter situation, but it actually has a good upside, which is we all know that actually investing in military actually generates jobs and actually it grows your GDP in a risky way because now we have become more militaristic, but actually it can be actually positive for the European economy. And remember this, Europe was once a military superpower. Remember World War I, remember World War II, and remember in those wars we were fighting among us, the French and the British, for example, against the Italians and the Germans, right? Now we have everybody on the same side building weapons for the same side. So be careful because now you think of Europe and you think, oh, Europe, weapons? No way. Hey, we did it before and there's no reason why we cannot do it again. We can build weapons and we can build many of them powerful and scary, right? So again, I foresee Europe actually showing its teeth more to Trump in a non-escalating kind of way, and I foresee Europe rearming quickly to be independent of the US. If you think about it, the strength of Europe has always been its stability, and the weakness has been its lack of speed. It's actually slow. What I'm forecasting is that 2026 is the year where Europe is going to try to fix this problem of speed, moving faster without losing its stability. And it's the year, as I said, in which Europe begins to take itself more seriously as a power in the international scene. And the best place where you can show that power is actually Greenland. Okie dokie. So now we're going to talk about one of the topics of the year, which is Greenland. And to explain why Greenland is so important, I'm going to start with a quote from the book The Lord of the Rings. Galadriel, the elven princess, actually tells Frodo one day, even the smallest being can change the future, meaning that a hobbit could actually save the world. Well, there's a distinction here. Greenland is not small by any means. It's actually quite large, but it's a perfect description of what's going on there. Greenland, being a relatively, empty piece of land with not much population, is actually now becoming one of the most important pieces of land on Earth. And it's not because Greenland changed, because Greenland has been the same since antiquity. It's more because the world changed, and because of the change of the world, now Greenland is very, very important. There's three forces that converge on Greenland at the same time. The first one is military geography. Basically, Greenland sits in the middle of the US and Russia. Just look at the map from above. Typically, we see the maps of Earth from the equator, but once you look from the North Pole, you'll realize that in the middle of the US and Russia, there's actually Greenland, right on the North Atlantic. And sure, it already hosts an American base and, early warning systems from incoming missiles. But in any serious conflict, whoever controls Greenland controls the air and the sea and the approach between the two nuclear superpowers. And by the way, this is not new. Greenland already hosted military installations in World War II. We knew this already. And actually, the US has discussed buying Greenland several times in the last century. But basically, now it's extremely more important now that Russia has announced, for example, that they have hypersonic missiles like the Kinzhal and the Oreshnik. Basically, in the current day and age, having an early warning missile system in Greenland, it actually makes a lot of sense. But that, I said there's three reasons. The first one is, again, military. The second reason, it has to do with climate change. Because of climate change, the North Pole is melting, and it's melting really, really quickly. And then as the ice melts, the Arctic is no longer ice. It's just water. And then what happens, again, look at a map from above of planet Earth, is that northern shipping routes actually open, not seasonally, but year-round. So basically, you can go from Canada to Russia through the North Pole, and it's actually way faster than to go around, let's say, the middle of the Earth. Again, this is what's called the Northwestern Route, and this was something that was being actually explored since antiquity. But now, because of the polar cap melting, that trade route is actually very, very interesting. And what sits exactly on the middle of that trade route? Greenland. So if you want to go from point A to point B, the typical seaport as a stopover for this trade route is actually Greenland. And that means shorter routes between Asia, Europe, and North America. And who wants those routes? China. So the US is actually moving towards Greenland because it wants to make sure China does not get there first with some sort of alliance with Greenland. And so basically, the Arctic is no longer just frozen. Now it becomes a hub for transportation. And of course, there's a third reason. I talk about the military importance of Greenland, the trade importance of Greenland, and the third one is resources. Remember, Greenland has been covered in ice since antiquity, but that ice is melting, and basically we're discovering the island underneath the ice. And we know, because there's been drills and samples, that Greenland holds rare earth materials, the critical ones, the kind of stuff you need for green tech, for advanced weapons, for electronics, and for decades, those resources were actually inaccessible. But now, as the ice retreats, they are not. And of course, Trump is not thinking this year. No, Trump is thinking, remember when the US bought Alaska from the Russians back in the day and they discovered oil in Alaska? Or remember when the US bought Florida from Spain, actually, back in the day, right? Trump is thinking in historical time frames. And in that respect, owning Greenland for the future can become a vast resource for rare earth materials and, richness that are actually underneath the soil. And that's the reason why Greenland suddenly shows up in speeches day in and day out. Really, does Trump care about Greenland from a political standpoint? No, not really. It's more about controlling that piece of land because he sees that unless he controls it, China could, and that is what becomes really, really dangerous in the mind of Trump. Trump's fear is not really Copenhagen, it's actually Beijing, gaining influence there through diplomacy, through investments, Chinese investment in Greenland, long-term agreements. We'll talk about Africa later, and you'll see how China is actually securing access to Africa through building seaports with Chinese money. Same thing could happen in Greenland. It's a typical imperial thinking of, unless I control this place, somebody else will, and that is a danger, right? But of course, Trump here is making a miscalculation. Trump, because he's American, and people from the US, they tend to be very America-centric. They look at Greenland and they see Denmark. A small country, very limited military. So in his brain, this is easy math. It's kind of like Venezuela Part 2. I sent a few Marines and I conquered the place. But what he underestimates is actually that Denmark is not Denmark. As we know on this side of the world, Denmark is the European Union, 27 countries, the largest integrated market on earth, a bloc with enormous economic leverage, and now rapidly a growing military power, as we have said before. And so that's the blind spot when you think in this old school imperial thinking, that you're assuming that power is something that's bilateral, the US versus Denmark, but you don't understand that this is not one country versus another, because again, we Europeans, we're not in the age of empires, we're in the age of alliances, and Denmark is part of an alliance, so it's not going to be so easy for Trump to actually get Greenland. So let's be clear about what I think can and cannot happen. First of all, I think Trump will never invade Greenland. Okay, never. There's a reason for that, which is Denmark is a member of NATO, the same as the US, and then this would be an aggression from one member of NATO to another member of NATO. And honestly, I don't know what would even happen from a treaty standpoint, but what would happen in a practical way is that would destroy NATO overnight. And NATO is needed because remember that when the time comes, NATO is our line of defense against Russia and against China. So even Trump, I think, will never dare to destroy NATO because NATO, as much as he complains, is actually something very convenient for our future together. So first, I don't think he will invade Greenland. Second, I don't think he will buy it either. That's kind of like thinking, again, imperial thinking, 1900s. We are in 2026. No matter how much money you offer, that Denmark will never sell Greenland. It's absurd. It reminds you back in the day when there was like a very right-wing party in Germany in the 80s or 90s that tried to buy the island of Mallorca from Spain. And Spain said, what are you talking about? We don't sell territory. That's not how it works. So again, no invasion, no buying the territory. So what I think will happen is way more subtle, which is, pressure, security treaties, economic leverage, so that what happens is that basically the US locks Greenland, into the American sphere of influence, not through tanks or flags, but through influence. This is geopolitics in 2026. The old empires, as I said before, try to secure and expand their zone of influence before another player steps in. And that's what could happen. That China gets access to Greenland and then the US is in a very bad position. So again, Greenland most likely is going to fall under the American sphere of influence, not through transfer, but through some sort of treaty. And I expect the US to vastly expand their military presence on Greenland with bases and, soldiers and et cetera, to stop China. And now let's talk about the other side of the world. And let's talk about China, actually. I want to talk about our next hotspot, which is not about roots or minerals. It's about the heart of modern civilization itself. Chips, and that place is Taiwan. Again, if Greenland was about routes and warning systems and minerals and all that kind of stuff, Taiwan is about the industrial survival of the West and actually the identity of the Chinese culture. Let me tell each one of these separately. First, Taiwan sits at the center of the global semiconductor production. For historical reasons, Taiwan produces most of the chips that you've heard about from, Intel and Nvidia and Apple and all that kind of stuff. Most of that comes from Taiwan. They specialize in chip production, not only for computers, but also for cell phones, for cars, for weapons, for anything. Okay. So modern economies, they cannot function without these chips that actually Taiwan provides. Okay. So first thing of all, we need Taiwan because Taiwan is a factory of semiconductors. But it's not just a factory. If you know a little bit about Chinese history, it's the unresolved ending of the Chinese Civil War. Let's go back in time with our spaceship to 1949. Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Party, they take over mainland China. And actually on the other side, there was Chiang Kai-shek, which was the leader of the opposing army to the socialist army in China, right? What happened is that Chiang Kai-shek and his followers, they fled the mainland and they actually resettled in Taiwan. And basically, two Chinas were born. And again, if you're Chinese watching this video from mainland China, I don't want to offend anyone. I'm just describing the perspectives on things. If you ask a mainland Chinese, they will tell you that Taiwan is China under the principle of one China that has been repeated once and again by Xi Jinping. If you ask somebody from Taiwan, they will say Taiwan is a different nation with a different history and a separate identity. And again, I don't care who wins and who loses. I'm just describing a situation that has been going for 70 years. And basically, the problem is that this separate identity that the Taiwanese, they claim to have, it controls, again, semiconductor production through the control of one of the most important companies on earth. Sure, everybody knows Apple, everybody knows Nvidia, but maybe you've never heard about a company called TSMC, which stands for Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And this is the state-owned company that actually manufactures all the chips that you've heard about. Nvidia depends on it, Apple depends on it, Intel depends on it, every modern weapon system, every car, anything that you can think of, basically it's manufactured in Taiwan when it comes to chips and memory and stuff like that. So if Taiwan was absorbed by China, the shock would not be political, it will be industrial. Taiwan doesn't just hurt the US, it reshapes the whole technological stack of the Western countries because we all have a supply chain dependency on Taiwan. And that's the reason why, of course, Washington is panicking every time they hear the word Taiwan. And that's the reason why, first, of course, there's military support from the US to Taiwan. But then there's a second, there's kind of like a two-pronged approach. On one side, military support to make sure China doesn't get close to Taiwan. And then on the second hand, and I will explain why the US is rapidly scrambling to move chip production from overseas, actually inland. And that's the reason why Apple and Nvidia, they all have announced plans to actually open plants on mainland US, for example, in Arizona. I think Nvidia or Apple had one actually coming that was started by Biden, and now it's actually being continued by Trump in a very aggressive way. And I don't say aggressive in a bad way, but in a very strong way, forcing the American companies to begin building chips on US soil. And it's not because it's cheaper. No, it's actually going to be more expensive. But because that dependence on Taiwan has become an existential risk. And that tells us something very, very important, which is sure, the US is actually speaking through two mouths. One mouth is actually saying we will defend Taiwan with our military might and, all yada, yada, yada. But then the second mouth is saying, yeah, but we're getting ready in case we can't. Because if the US was 100% confident that it can defend Taiwan no matter what, it would never begin building factories in mainland, right? So if they're building those factories, it's because they're preparing for two scenarios. One in which they can keep on defending Taiwan, another one in which they can't, either through military pressure from China or through some sort of, need to actually abandon Taiwan. And so that's why they're preparing to actually manufacture chips on the mainland of the US. So what's going to happen in 2026? Here's my forecast. I don't foresee an invasion. I think I've said this on previous videos. I've worked with Chinese companies for the last 20 years or so, making video games in my case, right? But I think I know Chinese culture quite well at this point in my life. An invasion would be catastrophic. From an economical, military, or political standpoint, it would be a disaster. And China knows this perfectly well. Remember this. China is not a nation built on war. Look at the last 70 years since World War II. How many wars has China been in? Zero. China is a nation built on trade. Is it a nation of people who buy and sell goods, especially sell goods? China hates wars because they are unpredictable, destructive, and they're bad for business. And so China will do everything it can to take Taiwan, because they want to take Taiwan for sure, without firing a shot. And how are they going to do that? Well, if you know a little bit of Chinese history, we need to look no further than Hong Kong to understand what China is going to attempt. And I know this really well, by the way, because I was working in Hong Kong when Hong Kong was actually regained by China some years ago. Let me tell you the story. Remember, Hong Kong used to be a British colony for many, many decades. And then what happened is there was a treaty to actually return Hong Kong to China under the principle of one country, two systems, mainland China having one system and Hong Kong having a little bit of an autonomy. But let's face it, slowly Hong Kong is being merged into the Chinese model, even though the people from Hong Kong back in the day, they hated it, they resisted, and they believed the system, the US and the UK, etc., they would protect them. But China conquered Hong Kong, and it didn't win with tanks, it won through patience. Remember this, China is a 5,000-year-old nation. They know how to play the long game really well. What they did is that they raised the cost of resistance by, putting, people in jail and, basically stopping the resistance step by step, slowly, year by year. And then they lowered the cost of actually compliance and obedience. And by doing this, they slowly reshaped the institutions. They infiltrated the power structures, in Hong Kong. And in the end, what happens is Hong Kong is now basically part of China. And again, I'm not saying this in a positive or negative way. I'm just explaining things. Taiwan, yeah, sure, it looks different on the surface. They have a stronger democracy, stronger identity, stronger allies. Sure, but you know what? The logic is basically the same. China does not really need Taiwan to love Beijing. What they want is that year by year the resistance fades, and basically at some point the resistance is low enough so that they can take it over. And actually, it's not really the resistance of Taiwan. What they care about is the resistance of the US. So really, how long can the US support Taiwan until it says, you know what, it's not worth it. We're already manufacturing chips in mainland USA. Let's have China actually own Taiwan, right? So now I'm going to move on to my third hotspot, which is Africa. Africa is the typical quiet winner that nobody's talking about, but they should. Africa is by no means going to become a battlefield. I don't think that's going to be the case. And I don't think nothing super important is going to happen there this year. But it's actually the swing continent of the 21st century. Whoever controls Africa is going to win, not because of war, but because of alignment. Let me explain. Africa is young in terms of democracy, demographics. It's fast growing and it's extremely rich on resources, many of those untapped. It's underbuilt in terms of infrastructure and it's politically flexible. So of course it can be swayed to one bloc or another through intervention from the different leaders of each one of the blocks. So again, whoever aligns Africa with his own model is going to win on the long game, because just look at the size of Africa and imagine all the resources are there. So Africa will not decide the next war, but it will decide where the economic gravity well settles during the 21st century. As of now, it's very clear that there's one player who's really ahead of others on the game of controlling Africa. And that player is China. China understood Africa and its value very early, and it entered Africa not with ideology, but with infrastructure. It offered roads, ports, railways, power plants. It didn't start with speeches about communism and socialism and changing society. No, it started with concrete. For example, it built a port in Djibouti. It built railroad lines so that every country in Africa that's landlocked could have access to the sea. Why? To use those accesses to the sea as shipping routes towards and back from China. It built power grids where there were none. And so at the same time, what happened is by doing this, China locked in access to resources. The Chinese model in Africa was like, hey, we will build infrastructure for you in very convenient terms in terms of finances, and we will finance this with super long-term loans. But then we want a treaty to be able to extract resources from here in a way that's beneficial for both of us, but of course it's beneficial for China. And so China is actually extracting cobalt from Congo, and cobalt is actually the basis of a mineral called coltan. And coltan, which is an alloy of cobalt and tantalum, it's actually used for cell phone production. From Zambia, it's actually taking copper. From Angola, it's actually taking oil, not through invasions, not through regime change or anything like that. No, just long-term supply deals, very pragmatic, very Chinese style. China offers speed, fast money, loans of heavy sums backed by the state, by China, who's of course extremely wealthy, and very long timelines to return those loans with few political conditions. Of course, sure, Europe that tries to do the same, and the US tried to do the same, but basically we are way slower than China, and we come with kind of like lectures attached. We say, oh yeah, we'll give you money, but you need to, do this thing about human rights or do this thing about democracy and yada, 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 And of course, from an African government point of view, the choice is brutally simple, which is, sure, these guys are going to give us bridges and roads in 5 years and they don't ask for anything in return in terms of restructuring the country. And these guys, they come with lots of red tape and, red strings attached. So we go with the Chinese, And of course, there's also history, and history benefits China in Africa. Africa's relationship with Europe and the US, even though time has passed, is still tainted by slavery and colonialism. Remember, the US actually took slaves from Africa into the US to work on the cotton fields. And remember, the EU used basically Africa for colonies and extracting resources, and we imposed borders with them, to African nations with a pen and paper, and we have been interfering in their affairs since they regained independence. So again, when the West says, oh, we want to help Africa, Africa doesn't really listen, and it listens better to the voice of China, which comes with less history and less red tape. And it's telling them, hey, I don't care how you run your country. I'm purely transactional. I'll give you a port, and you give me access to this mineral. And that resonates. And, Africa is not choosing China just because China is good. They're choosing China because it's reliable, and it doesn't require any big changes to the structure of those countries. So the real shift, as you can see, is happening in different parts of the world, which are actually going to become hotspots. We've seen Greenland, we've seen Taiwan, we've seen Africa. Africa is going to be kind of like a slow burn, but it's still going to be very relevant in 2026. And again, Africa shows you what happens when an untapped territory enters the spheres of influence of the big empires. Now I'm going to tell you about a territory that's actually the reverse. It's a territory that is actually exiting the sphere of influence of the empires, and that territory is Iran. So after, Africa, let's look at Iran, because the contrast is actually huge. Everybody wants Africa on their side. Nobody wants Iran on their side. It's kind of like interesting, Iran, sure, it's powerful, it's militaristic, it's a big country. It has been under sanctions from the West, for a long time because of all the nuclear weapons and the position of Iran against Israel. And Iran, let's face it, it's alive just basically because it's part of the Russian sphere of influence. Russia and Iran, they have deep trade in all areas. For example, the drones that basically Russia is using to bomb Ukraine are actually supplied by Iran, for example, right? Then to understand what's going to happen in Iran, we need to talk a little bit about religion. Remember, Iran is Shia. So in Islam, there's two basically branches. One is Shia and the other one is Sunni. Shia is basically Iran, and Sunni is actually most of the others, basically. Sunni is actually Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and many of the smaller countries on that region. So what I'm trying to say is that Iran and the surrounding Arab countries, they come from different Muslim traditions, and they're natural enemies from one another. But not only that, but actually they're enemies of Israel. And it's interesting because if you think about it, Israel has been in a bad situation with most of the Arab countries since the birth of Israel in the 1940s. But actually, through the Accords of Abraham that were fostered by the US, actually now Israel is at peace with a lot of the Muslim world, including Saudi Arabia and including the United Arab Emirates. And who is actually against Israel by far? Iran. So again, the interesting part is, that sentence of the enemy of my enemy is actually my friend. Now, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, actually, they get along with Israel and they have a common enemy, which is Iran. So again, Iran is on the weak end of the stick, if you know what I mean. None of the regional powers, they want a strong Iran. All of them benefit if Iran becomes actually weaker, and the US knows this perfectly well. And remember, the US is an ally of all these nations, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and of course Israel. They all want a weaker Iran, and they want a weaker Iran in a regional scale, and also in the case of the US, they want a weaker Iran because of Russia. Remember, Iran and Russia is a vector, and then basically Trump is doing something very wise, which is trying to weaken Russia without confronting Putin head to head. That would be a disaster. So he's trying to weaken Russia by actually cutting Russia's supply chain. For example, Venezuela. That's the reason why Trump went for Venezuela. He doesn't really want Venezuela that much. What he wants is actually to stop the supply of oil from Venezuela into Russia and China. So when it comes to Iran, basically Trump is thinking, if I take over Iran, Russia weakens, and that's a good thing because that makes for example, war in Ukraine less sustainable, and that makes his rival, which is Russia, actually weaker. So the question is, how do we crack Iran? We have been trying, since the Ayatollahs came into power in the 70s, we have been trying to basically get rid of the regime of the Ayatollahs in Iran. Well, the current thinking is that, of course, the only way to crack Iran is from inside. Invading Iran, it's a no-brainer. It's a no. You need to make sure that the population of Iran itself actually, revolts and takes power and basically gets rid of the regime of the Ayatollahs. So that's the reason why there's so many protests in Iran these days. Actually, today, there's a young population. There's economic stagnation that's been running for decades, and that economic stagnation, by the way, is caused, of course, by the sanctions imposed by the West on Iran, and of course, social repression. Let's be very clear: Iran is hell. The respect of minorities and the respect of people who think differently from the regime of the Ayatollahs, of course, is very, very heavily persecuted, and so the population of Iran is unhappy, and that's the reason there's protests. Of course, there's protests. They may be fostered, behind the curtain by the West and, by CIA and et cetera, but still the situation in Iran is actually quite dire, and the thing is, there's one thing we need to keep an eye on in 2026 about Iran, because many times when you have protests, what you need is some sort of figurehead. What you need is somebody to become the leader of those protests. Think about India. India in the 1940s, they actually wanted to move away from Great Britain, right? But they needed Gandhi. Gandhi became kind of like the poster of the revolt against the British rule. Think about South Africa. South Africa, apartheid, they needed Mandela. Okay, the thing is, in Iran, there's never been a clear person who was actually the leader of the opposition, so that those who want change, they see a sense of hope, a sense of there's an alternative. Okay, now we have that person. And that person seems to be Reza Pahlavi. Reza Pahlavi is actually the son of the Shah. Remember that before the regime of the Ayatollahs, actually, Iran was actually kind of like a similar to monarchy, and the ruler of the monarchy was the Shah of Persia, the father of Reza Pahlavi. Reza Pahlavi now is in his 50s or 60s. He actually lives in the US, and he doesn't see himself as a king returning to his kingdom. No, he sees himself as a symbol, a reminder that a different system in Iran could actually exist, and that he could actually lead that transition from a deeply religious, deeply anachronistic Iran, which is the current regime in Iran, to modern Iran, to a free Iran with democracy and with elections, etc. You need to understand that regimes sometimes they don't fall because people protest. No, they don't. They fall when people see that something else is possible, when they have some sort of hope. And basically, Reza Pahlavi, this person, is actually the hope of the Iranian people, thinking, you know what, hey, maybe we could do this. Reza Pahlavi, he's very active on social media. I think he has about 1.7 million followers on Twitter. Many of those are people from Iran, actually in the country or abroad, who are dreaming of a different world or different system for their country. So again, I don't think the US is ready to invade Iran. That's never going to happen. It's a really bad idea. It will have a huge a huge military cost. What it wants is internal exhaustion, a little bit like what China's playbook with Taiwan looks like. So sanctions, diplomatic isolation, information pressure, so that by doing that, the internal turmoil in Iran actually becomes bigger, a revolt can emerge, and that is designed to generate the conditions for a collapse. Again, the whole idea is Iran collapsing from within, because if that happens, the US wins against Russia, Saudi Arabia wins, the United Arab Emirates wins, Israel wins, and Russia loses. So again, my forecast is very simple. I think it's actually quite likely that we see a regime change in Iran soon. I hope it's this year. I would be extremely happy to see that happen. The classic internal revolution that ends with the toppling of the current regime. And really the question is, will that be a spontaneous revolution? Well, do you want to believe that? Or is this going to be fueled by, foreign powers infiltrating agents like, CIA and Saudi Arabia and UAE to actually foster that protest until, things happen? We'll see. We'll see. But, I think there's hope in Iran for the first time in years, and I'm really hoping that we are able to see that next year. Now I want to talk about India. I know India really, really well because I'm working in India now. That's my current job. I go to India 5 times a year, and I've let them last on purpose because India is playing a different game with a different pace as the others. While everybody else is actually shouting and threatening and sanctioning and posturing, India is staying quiet. Their strategy is actually quite simple. All my life I've been a mid-distance runner. That's what I do. I run 10Ks every week, and if you follow a 10K race or a marathon, typically what happens is that on the first and second position, there's guys running and they think they will win, but they won't, because what happens is that they will get exhausted. And during the race, the guys from Kenya and Tanzania and Ethiopia, they're typically running on the third, fourth, and fifth position. And then when the first ones, they give signals that they're beginning to feel weak, those guys in the middle of the race are going to speed up, take over, and those are the ones who are going to win. That's the game of India. It's a slow game. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And basically what India is doing is just letting the others fight among themselves, and then they keep doing their own thing, which is not wasting energy, just keeping discipline. The current president of India, Narendra Modi, is actually trying to be in good terms with everybody. He's buying weapons and oil from Russia. He's trading with Europe. And then in the afternoon, he's actually talking with Xi Jinping. And then he still manages to keep a smile on the face of Donald Trump in the evening. You see, they keep all channels open with everyone under the reason that, of course, because India is a developing nation in some areas, they need to talk with everybody to actually bring the country out of poverty. But India, again, they're doing a game that's actually very old but very smart, which is when empires fight each other, they exhaust themselves. They burn money, they burn credibility, they break alliances. But then the silent runner, and that's India, they don't. What they're doing, they're focusing on growth. Demographics. India is 1.4 billion people. When you have 1.4 billion people, that becomes a huge internal market. That those people actually become leaving the fields and living in cities and actually begin consuming goods and services. They're focusing on manufacturing. They're offering their services to manufacture things for other countries. The playbook of India is very similar to the playbook of China. When I first went to China about 20 years ago, which has become useful for other countries, and by doing that, make your country grow until there's a moment in which there's kind of like a tipping point and you become a worldwide superpower. So now India is building capacity. And again, in the short term, they don't need to beat anyone today. That's not the point. They just need to be still standing when the others begin getting tired. So again, through history, you have had different empires, like the Spanish Empire and then the British Empire, and then you have the US empire. And then now we're discussing if the US will actually yield to China. And my thinking is, India goes after. That's kind of like the structure, because this race is not a 100-meter race. This is a marathon. And typically on marathon, the winner is not the one you're watching. It's the one that's actually behind. And on the final lap, it still has energy to speed up. And when that happens, when they can speed up, India will not need to shout. The only thing it will need to do is speed up a little bit, fueled by its own 1.4 billion people, like China did in the 90s. And at this point, now that I mentioned China, you may be thinking, hey, Danny, sure, but you haven't talked about China yet. And that was my trick. I don't need to talk about China because all this video is about China. And maybe you don't get it, but please look at the map again. Why does the US care about Greenland? Because China could be taking it over and own the trans-Antarctic route. Why did the US take over Venezuela? Well, because oil is leverage and China needs oil to keep growing, and Venezuela has the largest depots of oil on earth. Why does Iran matter? Iran matters because by weakening Iran, you weaken Russia, and if you weaken Russia, you isolate China. You see? So really, all of this video is about actually controlling China. For example, Taiwan. Do I really need to explain why Taiwan is important for China? No. So the whole realignment of 2026, which I have been explaining on this video, only makes sense once you put China in the center of the photo. China is the gravity well that's bending everybody else's behavior. The US has discovered one thing the hard way, which is through the 90s and 2000s, most American companies exported their manufacturing to China. And that was a big mistake because now they depend on China. And the problem is China has become a giant with, the Huawei's and the BYDs and, all these kind of companies that they are now world-class behemoths. And what happens that if we were in a free market world, it remains to be seen if the US could actually compete with China. Honestly, I think it couldn't. So what the US is trying is, because we cannot be in a free market society, globalization, because China most likely would win, what it's trying to do, the US is trying to sabotage the expansion of China, slow down its conquest of the world by blocking access, by denying inputs to China, by controlling choke points. So it's not really a rivalry of ideologies anymore. It's not about communism or capitalism. No, it's a rivalry of supply chains. And once you see that, all the new world order falls into place, and it's actually very, very simple. What I have been explaining about, Greenland and the EU, etc., etc., etc. All of this is actually the new world, which is two empires, the US and China, trying to beat each other and trying to secure and expand their zones of influence. Let me wrap up the video with two very, very simple examples. Panama and Bolivia. Panama has the control of the canal. One of the most important trade routes on earth, and it's a choke point. Okay, who's the president of Panama? Now the president of Panama is a guy called Jose Raul Mulino. Okay, Panama, because it's actually this guy Mulino is actually pro-Trump. So pro-US basically. Panama as a result has frozen all Chinese-linked infrastructure projects, and it has exited the China Belt and Road Initiative. The China Belt and Road Initiative is kind of the modern equivalent of Silk Road, a huge project by Xi Jinping. So Panama exited that project, prompted, of course, by Donald Trump, and has openly coordinated the canal security with Washington. The US, who was actually the one who actually built this canal back in the day, 100 years ago or so, the US doesn't want to own the canal. Now, it wants to make sure China does not own the canal. You see? Now, second example, Bolivia. Bolivia in South America is a key country. Why? Because it controls lithium. Okay, lithium, the metal, it's actually the future of electric cells, be it for a cell phone, be it for a car, be it for whatever. The lithium is key for the future of the energy transition. Lithium is actually split between Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. Okay, so of course, controlling Bolivia is extremely important both for China and for the US. Okay, what's going on with Bolivia? Well, the government of Bolivia is actually left-wing. It's a socialist country. Remember the past president Evo Morales, and now we're in the same kind of era. And so the government keeps strong state control and favors Chinese firms when it comes to extraction and processing of lithium, explicitly rejecting US-style intervention. So that, for Washington, is a problem. Argentina, it's aligned with him through, Milei. Chile just got a new president, which is aligned with Trump, but Bolivia does not. Bolivia is actually on the enemy zone of control. So, of course, Bolivia in 2026 is going to become a pressure point. I don't think there's going to be tanks or something like this, but of course, there's going to be the buildup of a narrative, same thing with that happened with Venezuela, that Bolivia is actually, the enemy and that we need to somehow control Bolivia, yada, yada, yada. Not because we care about the policy of Bolivia, but because we care about lithium. And this is what I was trying to say. This is a confrontation between the US and China, and all the rest of the world is actually the pieces that these two countries are moving to try to become the superpower of the 21st century. And sure, at this point, you may be thinking we are dangerously drifting back towards 1910, an age of empires, over spheres of influence, of chest thumping, of resource grabs. And sure, the mindset is eerily familiar, and that is not good news. But the good news is that there's some key differences that make me be a little bit more hopeful, which is, I don't think we're back in World War I. And this is going to sound like a joke, but it's not a joke. I don't think we're back to World War I because World War I already happened, and World War II too. What I mean by that is that we learn from those things, and we made changes to the structure of the world so that we don't go back to those times again. At this point, we have learned from history, and second, we have this thing called nuclear weapons that makes a total war completely out of the table, if you ask me, because it will only ensure mutual assured destruction for both superpowers. So I don't think we're heading towards a military conflict, but the conflict, because it cannot be military, it's just mutating. Instead of trenches, we get economic trenches, trade wars, sanctions, technology bans. Like, for example, when Donald Trump said it was forbidden to export certain NVIDIA chips to China, for example, resource denial by controlling, Greenland and Bolivia and, all the things I have spoken on this video, and control of routes and choke points, So this is not military warfare. It's economic warfare. And once you understand that we're entering this era of neo-imperialism dominated by the US and China as the two main empires, everything falls into place, everything becomes focused, So how will this year play out? Well, I think it's quite clear. By the end of this year, we're going to see United States looking way more openly imperial, sphere of influence, control of resources, etc. Not through conquest, but through pressure. I suspect all of Latin America is going to fall tighter into the US orbit, and that's going to be good news for those who have already been aligned with the US. It's, for example, Argentina and Chile and yada, yada, yada. And it's bad news for the others, so I expect, motions and trouble with places like Bolivia and Cuba and many others. So again, due to the Dunroe doctrine, basically Latin America is going to go full on US most likely. Greenland is going to be kind of like a middle of the road, and we need to see how that plays out. I think it's going to fall on the US side most likely as well, because again, the EU actually favors the US more than it favors China. Iran could see a regime change, which would be great news for anybody who actually loves freedom and, people being happy and having a prospect of a decent life. Russia, honestly, I don't foresee big changes for Russia because Mr. Putin is really stubborn and he's never going to admit that he made a mistake invading Ukraine. So he's going to keep going there, even though, that means that most of the young men he's sending to the front lines are going to return inside a body bag, But basically, Putin has an iron grip on his population, so I don't see that he has any sort of pressure to change course because nobody's forcing him to stop. He's trapped with the same very imperial logic that he chose, if you think about it, because Putin sees himself like a czar in a way, and now he cannot change direction. Europe, honestly, I think Europe will look different this year, more serious against the US, more armed. Sure, looking to Washington as our main ally, because it's still our main ally, but opening lines of communication with Beijing, with Delhi, not being so naive as to think that we can always trust the US, but opening so that maybe we can threaten with new alliances that, of course, the US can never allow. So, if the EU actually moved towards China, the US would be in a really big trouble. So I'm sure that's our main leverage point in this year. China will keep doing what it does best, which is no noise, no speeches, no wars, just extend its influence on Africa, on Europe, more pressure specifically on Taiwan, patiently, methodically, winning without invading. And India, as I said, this is the silent runner in the middle of the pack, just doing its own thing, no leading, no shouting, trying to make deals with everyone and letting all the loud empires exhaust themselves. So to wrap up, I don't think 2026 will be the year where everything explodes. No, it will just be the year in which we realize what is the new world balance, the new world order. The age of globalization is over. The age of empires has begun. And in the 21st century, the strongest empire will not be the ones who conquer land or have bigger armies, but they will be the ones who are more trusted to do business with. Because the future of the world, the future of all of us will not be conquered. It will be negotiated. Thank you for watching this video. It's a long video, but I wanted to really take the time to explain what is the status of the world and what I think is going to happen. What are the movements that we are going to see during this year in terms of trends, in terms of hotspots, in terms of the different actors. This is DECODE, my podcast where I post videos about the modern world every week, trying to explain things in layman terms so that this is like we're in a bar and I'm your friend trying to make sense of something that's complex, such as geopolitics. This is my English channel. I'm actually a Spanish podcaster, and now I'm doing my videos in English too to actually expand my audience. So if you enjoy the kind of content I do, I would ask you for 3 really simple things. First, hit like, because when you hit like, I see the percentage of people who actually enjoy certain videos or certain other videos. So that's very, very helpful for me. Second, there's a new thing that you can do, which is press hype. On the mobile app specifically, once you like the video, you'll see a new button that says hype. If you press hype, that actually informs the YouTube algorithm that my community is actually supporting that video, and that what it does is that it actually boosts the visibility of my videos to the broader audience of YouTube. So hype is very, very important for the growth of these small channels. So if you could press hype on my videos, I would really, really appreciate it. And of course, last but not least, I would ask you to subscribe to DECODE. My English channel is now about 2 months old. We're growing very fast and I have big plans for the year. So I will love your support along this journey. And so if you subscribe to DECODE, that's the way that you tell me, hey, Danny, I enjoy what you did. Please keep doing it. So that was it for today. I hope to see you on the next episode of DECODE.